For most of my adult life, I believed the worst thing that could happen to our family business was a bad quarter, a damaged shipment, or a client who decided to take their money somewhere cheaper. My name is Genevieve Achterberg, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. I was wrong. The worst thing was my brother. It started with a polite phone call on a Tuesday morning, the kind of call that sounds routine until you realize every word in it is a threat. I was in my office at Achterberg Fine Furniture, the company my father had built from nothing over 35 years, when my assistant buzzed me and said there was a CEO on the line who insisted he needed to speak to a shareholder immediately. That alone was odd enough that I frowned at the phone before picking it up. We did not get calls like that. We got calls about delayed freight, custom stain samples, upholstery lead times, and the occasional architect asking whether we could match a walnut finish from a century-old drawing. We did not get calls from CEOs asking to speak to shareholders. "This is Genevieve Achterberg," I said. The voice on the other end was smooth, practiced, and irritatingly calm. "Miss Achterberg, my name is Rhett Bellamy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Bellamy Home Furnishings. I'm calling to schedule our first shareholder meeting." I actually laughed once because I assumed I had misheard him. "I'm sorry," I said. "Our family company doesn't have outside shareholders." There was a brief pause, the kind that feels deliberate even through a phone line. "That's interesting," he said, still polite, "because I've formally acquired a significant minority stake in Achterberg Fine Furniture. 40% to be precise. I wanted to introduce myself before we set the meeting date." I stood up so fast my chair rolled backward and hit the filing cabinet. "That's impossible," I said. He sounded genuinely puzzled, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "I have the stock transfer agreement in front of me," he said. "My legal team processed it 3 months ago. The purchase was made directly from your brother Thaddeus Achterberg." For a moment I couldn't speak. I stared at the framed photo on my desk of my father in his workshop, sleeves rolled to the elbows, one hand resting on the back of a maple chair he had made with his own hands. Behind the glass, his expression was calm and exhausted and proud all at once. He had died 2 years earlier, and every major decision I made in that office still felt like I was asking him for permission. Thaddeus, my brother. No outside shareholders. No warning. No conversation. And somehow the rival company that had spent years trying to undercut us now owned nearly half of our business. "Mr. Bellamy," I said carefully, because I had spent enough years in client negotiations to know that if I lost my temper too early, I would lose the upper hand. "I need to verify what you're saying. I'll call you back." "Of course," he said. "I expected as much." I hung up and sat there with the phone still in my hand, listening to the blood pound in my ears. The first thing I wanted to do was call Thaddeus and scream until my throat hurt. The second thing I wanted to do was drive straight to the manufacturing floor and throw the papers in his face. The third thing was uglier than both of those, because for one stunned second I wondered whether this could somehow be a misunderstanding, some paperwork error, some bizarre private financing arrangement he had never explained because he assumed it wasn't my concern. But the moment I thought that, I knew it was not an accident. Thaddeus was many things, but careless with numbers was not one of them. He had run the manufacturing side of Achterberg Fine Furniture for more than a decade. He knew the value of every kiln-dried board, every hardware supplier, every labor contract. He was the kind of man who noticed when a crate had one extra screw missing from the invoice. If he had sold 40% of our family company to Bellamy Home Furnishings, he had done it deliberately. I locked my office door and pulled out the original governing documents. Our father had drafted the shareholder agreement with a corporate attorney decades ago, back when the company was still small enough to fit in a building that also served as storage. He had not been a fancy man, but he believed in protecting what he built. He had seen too many family businesses get torn apart because one sibling wanted to cash out while another wanted to keep going, or because death left a widow with an opinion and no context, or because a cousin showed up years later with lawyers and greed. So he had made the rules painfully clear. Any shareholder who wanted to sell had to offer their shares first to the other family shareholder at fair market value. If neither family member bought, an outside sale could only happen with unanimous board approval. And because our board consisted of the two of us, plus our father's longtime attorney in an advisory role, outside sales were supposed to be extremely rare. There was no board approval, there had been no notice, there had been no right of first refusal, and there was definitely no approval for selling to our biggest regional competitor. I read the language 3 times to make sure I wasn't missing a loophole. I wasn't. My father had built a wall around the company, and Thaddeus had apparently decided to climb over it with a ladder made of money. By the time I called Rhett back, my voice was steadier than I felt. "I've reviewed our agreement," I told him. "You should not have been able to purchase those shares without my consent." "That's unfortunate," he said. sounding more curious than worried. Our legal team believed the transfer was valid. Your legal team reviewed the shareholder agreement? Of course. We do diligence before any acquisition. That little phrase said so casually made my stomach twist. They had seen the agreement. They had known there were restrictions. And they had gone through with it anyway. I need the documents, I said. I can send them over, he replied. I'm willing to be reasonable. Reasonable. I nearly laughed again. Bellamy Home Furnishings had spent the better part of a decade trying to poach our commercial clients by underbidding us and promising faster turnaround times with cheaper materials. Their catalog always looked polished in the trade magazines, but the people who knew furniture knew the difference between elegant and disposable. Rhett Bellamy built volume. My father built pieces that outlived the people who bought them. Send them, I said, and do not contact our staff or our clients. He did not argue. That only made me trust him less. When I hung up, I sat very still for a while. The office around me was familiar in the way a childhood bedroom is familiar. The heavy oak desk had been my father's. The shelves were lined with sample books, client catalogs, and framed photographs of showrooms, trade events, and old projects we were proud of. A corner cabinet held a stack of chairs my father had repaired himself because he hated waste. Even the smell of the room, wood polish and paper, and something faintly earthy from the nearby mill, felt like part of my blood. My brother had sold a piece of that legacy to our rival. I should say now that Thaddeus and I were not always at odds. Growing up, we had been like any siblings close enough in age to fight over everything and then team up against the world. He was 2 years older, broad-shouldered and practical, the kind of kid who liked to take things apart to see how they worked. I was the one who liked to label the parts and figure out how to get them back together. Our father used to joke that Thaddeus could build the table and I could sell it. It turned out he was right. After our father retired 5 years ago, the company ownership had been split evenly between us. Thaddeus took over manufacturing operations because he knew the floor, the suppliers, the production schedules, the machinery. I handled sales, client relationships, and the outside face of the company. That arrangement had worked, mostly because each of us understood the other's strengths, and neither of us wanted to admit how much we relied on them. We also inherited our father's standards. He had never believed in rushing orders just to please impatient buyers. If a client wanted a custom dining room suite, he expected them to respect lead times. If a retailer wanted cheaper materials, he told them to go elsewhere. We were not the biggest company in the region, not by a long shot, but we had a reputation for integrity, craftsmanship, and consistency. Thaddeus, over the last few years, had begun to think that was our problem. I had heard him grumble often enough to know the shape of his frustration. He thought we moved too slowly. He thought I over-negotiated. He thought we lost opportunities because I cared too much about preserving margins and relationships and not enough about rapid growth. He had started talking the way younger executives talk in magazines, all scalability and market share and disruption, as though furniture were an app and not a physical object with a lifetime attached to it. But frustration is not the same as betrayal. I called Priscilla Nakamura, the attorney our father had used for years whenever anything got complicated. She specialized in shareholder disputes and family business succession issues, which meant she had seen this kind of mess before and never seemed surprised by it. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said after I explained the call. I told her everything, including the name Bellamy, and the fact that our competitor had apparently bought a 40% stake from Thaddeus 3 months earlier. There was a long silence on her end before she answered. "Do you have the shareholder agreement handy?" "Yes, read me the transfer clause." I did. "And the board approval clause?" "I did that too." When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Then this is not just an ugly surprise," she said. "This is likely a breach of contract, possibly a breach of fiduciary duty depending on how Thaddeus structured the sale and what he disclosed. And if Bellamy's legal team saw the agreement, they may have knowingly participated in the violation." "He sold to a direct competitor," I said, still unable to get my head around the words. "Why would he do that?" "Money," Priscilla said. "Resentment. Revenge. Or a mix of all three. We need to figure out the transaction terms, the source and use of the funds, and whether he was planning to leave the company before the sale. I want a forensic accountant involved." She recommended Cornelius Ekibi, a forensic accountant she trusted with high-conflict business cases. By the time I got his number and scheduled a call, I had stopped feeling shock and started feeling something colder. I wanted facts. Cornelius was the sort of man who made me think of a precision instrument. He spoke carefully, never wasted a sentence, and seemed incapable of being startled by human greed. He told me he could trace the purchase price, identify the transfer path, and look for any affiliated entities or side ventures tied to Thaddeus. Do not confront him yet, Priscilla said after we all spoke by conference call. If you let him know you're onto him before we understand the structure, he may start covering tracks or negotiating with Bellamy. We need the paper trail first. That was the hardest part. For the next several weeks, I had to keep working with my brother as though our lives were normal. We still sat in production meetings together. We still reviewed inventory, client deadlines, and wood sourcing. We still walked the floor and discussed what to prioritize for the next quarter. He still signed off on machinery maintenance and staffing schedules, and I still attended showroom appointments and negotiated with interior designers, as if my world had not just split down the middle. The only difference was that I now knew there was a rival company, one of our most aggressive competitors, sitting on 40% of the business from the inside. I did not know what was worse, that Thaddeus had done it, or that he had done it while looking me in the eye every day. The first time I had to sit across from him after the call from Rhett, I nearly lost my composure. It was a production review in the conference room off the mill, where we went over custom orders and material constraints. Thaddeus was in one of his usual work shirts, sleeves rolled, a pencil behind his ear. He looked exactly like he always had, which somehow made it harder. He was talking about a set of dining chairs for a hotel chain when he paused and looked at me. "You all right?" The question nearly undid me, because it was so ordinary. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded and went back to the spreadsheet. I wanted to throw the folder at his head. Instead, I watched him with a new kind of attention. He was calm, focused, and efficient, but there was something else in him, now I had not noticed before, or maybe had not wanted to notice. A certain tightness around the mouth, a restlessness in the way he kept checking his phone when he thought nobody saw. He was the kind of man who could hide a betrayal in plain sight because he had trained people to trust the practical side of him. Cornelius called me 4 days later. "I found the transaction," he said. "I closed my office door." The sale had not just happened. It had been structured to look clean on paper. Rhett Bellamy had paid a premium above fair market value for Thaddeus's shares, which was unusual enough to raise questions on its own. Thaddeus had walked away with far more money than an ordinary buyout would have produced. Cornelius believed Bellamy had overpaid because the stake was not just ownership, it was leverage. Any access to company records, board influence, or internal friction would be worth extra to a rival like Bellamy Home Furnishings. He wasn't just buying equity, Cornelius said. He was buying pressure, a foothold, information, possibly a strategic wedge if he intended to push for changes from the inside. Can he do that? Not without more ownership or your cooperation, but he can certainly cause headaches. At minimum, he gains visibility and a vote on certain matters depending on the company structure. We need to see exactly what rights the stock transfer granted and whether any side letters exist. There was more. Cornelius traced a large portion of the sale proceeds to an account I had never heard of, and from there to a business entity Thaddeus had formed quietly under a name that sounded almost bland enough to hide behind. It was a new furniture venture, small, at first glance, seeded with the very money Rhett had paid him. I sat down very hard when Cornelius said that. "He started another company?" "Yes," he said. "At least in formation. Incorporation documents, lease deposit, equipment orders, and early payroll setup. It appears to have been in progress for several months." My throat went dry. So this was not just a man who had decided he was angry and wanted out. This was a man who had been planning an exit. He had sold his stake in our family company to our biggest rival, pocketed an inflated price, and then used those proceeds to quietly build his own new business. He was not being pushed out. He was leaving on purpose, after setting up a second life with money he had made by violating the agreement our father had written to protect both of us. And he had continued showing up to work every day as if nothing had changed. That part hurt in a way I could not fully explain. If he had been openly miserable, openly desperate, openly angry, maybe I could have recognized the crack in him. But he had been there, calm and competent, helping supervise production, joking with staff, reviewing orders, touching the same unfinished wood our father had once handled. He had looked like family, he had looked like home, while all along he had been quietly moving pieces around the board. Cornelius kept digging. The next report showed that Rhett's premium payment had been higher than necessary by a margin that did not make ordinary business sense unless Bellamy expected some competitive benefit in return. It also showed that Thaddeus had begun consulting quietly with a small design firm about developing a new premium line, something he had never mentioned to me. The design drafts were not enough to prove intent on their own, but together with the stock sale they painted a picture I did not want to see. Thaddeus had been building a landing strip before he jumped. When Priscilla reviewed the findings, she told me to keep holding. "Not yet," she said. If we confront him before we know whether Bellamy is still holding the stock or whether there are side agreements, we lose leverage. I want the entire structure in front of us before we make a move. If this goes the way I think it will, we may be able to unwind the sale entirely. Unwind it? If the transfer violated a clear contractual restriction and Bellamy knew or should have known that, yes. It sounded good in theory. Living through it was another matter. Those weeks felt endless. I kept running the company by day and going home at night with my head full of legal language and betrayal. I slept badly. I stopped eating lunch half the time because my stomach felt permanently twisted. I began noticing old memories in a new light, as if our entire shared history had been quietly relabeled. I thought about our father teaching us in the workshop when we were teenagers, making us sandchair legs until our hands cramped so we would respect the finish. I thought about late nights during college breaks when Thaddeus and I stayed up in the warehouse building display samples because a trade show was coming and my father was too stubborn to ask for help. I thought about the day he told us he was retiring and said he expected us to keep each other honest because the business could survive many things, but not a lie between siblings. At the time, I had thought that meant the obvious kind of lie, not this. One evening I stayed late and wandered into the manufacturing floor after most of the workers had gone home. The building was quiet in that particular way. Only a furniture shop can be quiet, with the low echo of machinery, the smell of sawdust, and rows of finished pieces waiting under cloth covers like furniture in a museum after closing. Thaddeus was still there. He stood at a workbench with one hand resting on the edge of a cherry table, head bent, studying the grain. For one brief second I had the bizarre, painful impression that I was seeing our father from behind. Thaddeus had always had their same stubborn posture when he was thinking. He reached out and smoothed the surface of the wood with the flat of his palm, and the gesture was so familiar it nearly made me angry all over again. He looked up and saw me. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." I was checking the finish on the Kensington order. I nodded and let the silence stretch. He studied me with a slight narrowing of the eyes. "Something's wrong," he said. I almost told him then. I almost gave in to the raw need to hurl every fact at him right there under the warehouse lights. But Priscilla's warning was still in my head. Wait until everything is clear. Wait until he has nowhere to run. So I said, "I'm tired." He accepted that answer. But I noticed his face did not relax. That night I went home and stared at my ceiling for hours. By the time we finally had the full picture, the picture was ugly enough that even Priscilla looked grim when she spread the papers out across the conference table in my office. Cornelius had traced the funds through the sale and the new company. The purchase documents showed that Rhett Bellamy had bought 40% of Thaddeus's shares for a premium substantially above the likely valuation. The stock transfer agreement, however, was missing any indication that the required company approval had been obtained. More importantly, Bellamy's legal department had received the shareholder agreement during due diligence. They could not plausibly claim ignorance. Thaddeus's side was even worse. He had used the sale proceeds to fund an entity that would likely compete in the same market segment as us, though it was still small enough to be called a boutique venture if he was trying to make it sound less threatening. He had consulted with at least one former supplier of ours. He had reserved showroom space under a corporate alias, and he had apparently told a business banker that he was transitioning away from a legacy family operation. Legacy family operation. He meant us. Priscilla tapped the page with one finger. He was preparing a narrative, she said. If challenged, he could say he wanted independence, that he was dissatisfied, that he had every right to monetize his shares. But the outside sale clause is strong, and the competitor issue makes this much harder for Bellamy to defend. He likely thought you would be too surprised or too reluctant to make a scene. He was right that I was surprised. I said, "Surprise is not the same as weakness." The confrontation happened after hours on a Thursday. I asked Thaddeus to stay late for what I told him was a discussion about production scaling and inventory projections. He came into the manufacturing office wearing the same work shirt I had seen him in 100 times before. Priscilla was already there. Cornelius sat off to one side with a thick folder. The papers on the table looked almost absurdly ordinary, like a stack of meeting notes and invoices, until you knew they contained proof of a betrayal. Thaddeus took one look at the room and his expression changed. "What is this?" I did not answer right away. I wanted to watch him realize it. Priscilla stood and introduced herself in the crisp professional way lawyers do when they are about to ruin somebody's evening. "Thaddeus Achterberg. I represent Genevieve Achterberg regarding the unauthorized transfer of company shares to Bellamy Home Furnishings." He laughed once sharply. "Authorized?" I slid the shareholder agreement across the table. "Read the transfer clause," I said. He looked at me in disbelief, then looked down at the page. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. He skimmed the paragraph once. Then again, slower. I saw the exact moment his confidence faltered. That clause was always there, he said too quickly. Yes, Priscilla replied. It was also mandatory. You did not offer your shares to Ms. Achterberg at fair market value. You did not obtain unanimous board approval. You sold to a direct competitor with knowledge of the restriction. I owned my shares, he snapped. You did, I said, not unconditionally. He turned to me then, and for a second I saw something raw and almost wounded in his face. You went through my records? You sold part of our company to Bellamy, I said. You expect me not to look? The accusation hung between us, and I realized with a strange, sick feeling that he truly had expected me not to look. He had counted on me either trusting him too much or being too occupied to notice. He had mistaken my patience for passivity. Cornelius opened the folder and laid out the findings. The purchase price exceeded fair market value, he said, his tone level. There is no business rationale for the premium except strategic access and influence. Proceeds were then transferred into a newly formed entity associated with a separate furniture venture. Thaddeus's face changed again, this time into something like anger. You had me followed? No, I said. You left a trail. He looked from me to Priscilla to Cornelius and then back again, as if trying to decide which part of the situation he hated most. I was going to tell you, he said at last. I stared at him. Priscilla did not move. When? I asked. His jaw tightened. I don't know. Once I had things settled. Settled, I repeated. You mean after you sold your shares to our largest rival, funded your own new company, and left me holding the bag? I wasn't leaving you holding anything. That was the moment I understood just how far gone he was. He wasn't planning to betray me, not in his own head. He was planning to outgrow us. He had built a story in which he was the misunderstood practical one, the brother who finally stopped waiting for permission and took control of his future. In that story, I was simply the obstacle who would eventually have to accept his genius. Tell me why, Bellamy, I said. He pressed his lips together. Because he was willing to pay. That's not why, I said. You could have sold to me. You could have asked for a buyout. You could have come to me with your frustration years ago instead of doing this in secret. He looked away. Would you have listened? The question hit harder than I wanted to admit, because it was unfair in the way cowardly questions often are. It implied that I was the problem, that secrecy was a reasonable response to my supposed stubbornness, that his betrayal had grown out of some shared failure rather than his own choices. I took a breath. If you had told me you wanted out, I would have listened, I said. If you had told me you wanted a different role, I would have listened. If you had told me you wanted to split the company, negotiate a buyout, or even sell your shares to someone outside the family under lawful terms, I would have listened. What I would not have done is nod politely while you sold our father's company to Bellamy behind my back. He flinched at the mention of our father, and for a second I thought he might actually be ashamed. Then he folded his arms. You always thought the company was yours because you handled the clients. That is not what I thought. You made every decision like I was just the operations guy. Because you chose operations. I chose it because you always wanted to be the face of everything. My voice went cold. That is not the same as wanting to own it all. He started to say something else, but Priscilla cut in before the argument could spiral. This conversation may be emotionally satisfying, she said, but it is legally important only insofar as it confirms your awareness of the restrictions and your intent to proceed despite them. That shut him up. I watched my brother pace the length of the room and back again, hands on hips, breathing through his nose. He looked not like a mastermind, but like a man discovering that his choices had consequences. He finally stopped and said, "Lower now." Bellamy offered me a way out. There it was. A way out of what? I asked. He did not answer immediately. Of this, he said at last, and swept one hand vaguely toward the building, the machinery, the floor, the whole life we had inherited. This, the slow growth, the endless caution, the way every decision feels like it has to be approved by a museum board instead of a business. I almost laughed, but there was no humor in me. So you sold to a competitor because you were bored? His face hardened. I sold because I was done being told no. That was the truth. At least the part of it he was willing to admit. He had grown resentful of my caution, and probably of our father's caution before mine. He wanted faster expansion, more aggressive pricing, bigger contracts, and bolder market moves. When he didn't get them, he started to see himself as trapped. Bellamy, with their glossy promises and money, offered him not just cash, but the illusion of validation. Rhett Bellamy had apparently told him that his manufacturing expertise was underappreciated, that a man like him deserved a company with more ambition, and that Bellamy would gladly pay for both his shares and his insight. It was flattering enough to poison him. Priscilla asked the obvious question. Did Bellamy know the sale violated the shareholder agreement? Thaddeus hesitated. That hesitation said enough. I turned to Cornelius. He handed me another page from the file. Bellamy's attorneys had received the shareholder agreement during due diligence, and internal notes suggested they had flagged the first refusal and approval requirements. Whether Rhett had personally read every word or not, his team had seen the restriction. They had gone forward anyway, which meant they had either assumed we would swallow the insult or believed the risk of challenge was low. So they knew, I said. At minimum, they knew enough to be on notice, Priscilla said. That changes the posture significantly. Thaddeus looked from page to page, the color draining from his face as the practical reality settled in. What happens now? Priscilla sat down. Now we file suit to void the transfer, she said, because the company's governing documents were violated. The sale is vulnerable. We will seek injunctive relief immediately, notify Bellamy, and demand unwinding of the transaction. If they want to avoid a public fight, they can return the shares and take their money back. Thaddeus muttered something under his breath that I did not catch. What was that? I asked. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. I said you always choose the legal route because it lets you pretend this is all clean. That one hurt too, but I kept my voice steady. I choose the legal route because Father chose the legal route. He wrote the rules for a reason. Father wrote rules for people who still believed family meant something. I stared at him. That was the saddest thing he had said all night, because in that one sentence I could hear how far he had drifted from the person I thought I knew. He sounded like someone trying to justify a wound by turning it into philosophy. Family does mean something, I said. That's exactly why this is unforgivable. The lawsuit went in fast. Priscilla did not waste time. She moved with a kind of efficiency that made me grateful I had called her before I let emotion rule me. Our filing argued that the transfer was void because it violated a clear contractual right of first refusal and lacked required board approval. We also argued that Rhett Bellamy, through his legal team, had constructive if not actual notice of the restriction because the shareholder agreement had been produced during due diligence. In plain language, Bellamy could not claim to have bought something that the seller had no right to sell freely. The first reaction from Bellamy was predictably defensive. Then came the calls. Not from Rhett directly at first, but from lawyers. Always lawyers. Their tone changed once the suit landed. Suddenly the transfer was under review, then being evaluated, then subject to further clarification of certain governance provisions. The language of denial was every bit as polished as the first phone call had been. Rhett finally called me again 2 days later. This time his voice was not calm. Miss Achterberg, I understand you've filed suit. I have. I'd prefer we handle this discreetly. So would I said. You should have thought of that before purchasing shares your own attorneys knew were restricted. There was a pause. We believed the transfer could be interpreted differently. That's a very expensive interpretation. He sounded irritated now, though he tried to keep it neat. Your brother represented the shares as transferable. My brother is not the one who will be explaining this to a judge if it goes that far. I could hear him shifting on the other end, probably weighing whether to threaten, bargain, or retreat. What do you want? He asked. That was the real question. I wanted to keep my father's company intact. I wanted my brother to feel the weight of what he had done. I wanted Bellamy Home Furnishings to stop circling our business like a vulture in a tailored suit. Most of all, I wanted the last 2 months of dread to be undone. I want the sale unwound, I said. I want the shares returned. I want Bellamy out. And then I want the right to purchase Thaddeus's stake myself under the terms of the agreement. You'd buy him out? At fair market value, yes. There was another long silence. That's not how my client expected this to end, he said. Then your client should have checked the contract. He did not like that. Neither did Thaddeus when he found out what I was willing to do. The next morning he cornered me near the loading dock, where pallets of finished chairs were being prepared for shipment. His face was tight and pale, and he looked older than he had a week before. You're really going to force me out? I looked at him for a long second. You forced yourself out when you sold to Bellamy. He rubbed a hand across his mouth. You don't have to do this like a stranger. You made it a stranger's transaction. Genevieve, he said, and for once there was no edge in his voice, only something like fatigue. I was angry. The words sounded small compared to the damage. Angry enough to violate our father's agreement? He did not answer. Angry enough to hand our competitor a lever into the business? Still nothing. Angry enough to build a second company with the proceeds? His eyes flicked away. That told me everything I needed to know. He had not acted in a moment of heat, he had acted over time. Maybe anger had started it, but resentment and ambition had finished the job. He had built a private justification so he could keep showing up every day and pretending he still belonged. I'm done arguing about your feelings, I said. We're going to court if necessary. If Bellamy wants to unwind, we'll unwind. If not, Priscilla will drag every hidden detail into the open. He stared at me with disbelief, as if until that moment he still thought this could somehow be managed like a family disagreement. You'd really take my shares? I'd take back what's left of the business you tried to hand away. The first refusal clause worked the way it was supposed to work once it was finally invoked properly. With Bellamy retreating under legal pressure and trying to avoid the reputational stain of being named in a public dispute over a family company's governance, the stock transfer was vulnerable enough that Rhett chose to unwind it. That meant returning the shares to Thaddeus in exchange for a refund of the purchase price. It was an admission, in all but name, that the deal should never have happened. What he had paid for leverage became a very expensive lesson. Priscilla made sure the terms of the unwind were documented cleanly so Bellamy could not later spin the situation as a voluntary strategic shift. Cornelius reviewed every transaction related to the sale so there would be no surprises in the accounting. Then I exercised my own right of first refusal. I bought Thaddeus's stake directly at fair market value. The transfer was clean, legal, and final. I remember signing the documents with a strange, numb steadiness. The pen felt too light in my hand. My signature was the same one I had used on client contracts, vendor agreements, and payroll authorizations for years, but this one felt different because it closed a door I never imagined would have to be shut. When the last page was signed, Priscilla stacked the papers and said, "It's done." I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt grief and anger and a bitter kind of relief all at once. Thaddeus walked out of the building shortly afterward with a cardboard box under one arm. It held his personal things from the office: a mug, a few notebooks, his old calipers, a framed photo of our father in front of the original workshop. I had not realized until then that he had kept that photo in his office all these years. He paused beside my desk before leaving. For 1 second, I thought he might say he was sorry. Instead, he said, "You always wanted the company more than anything." I looked up at him. "No," I said quietly. "I wanted my brother to care about it as much as I did." He stood there for a moment with the box in his arms, and I could see him trying to decide whether to defend himself one last time. He did not. Then he left. The weeks after that were full of consequences. Bellamy Home Furnishings issued the expected polished statement about resolving a misunderstanding regarding a proposed investment without admitting fault. In private, I knew they had taken a reputational hit they had not wanted. Rival companies can survive a lot, but no one in our industry likes being known as the firm that tried to buy a family business through a disputed share transfer. The legal risk alone was enough to make them back off. Thaddeus's new venture turned out to be real, but not nearly as stable as he had apparently imagined. Without the cash infusion from a clean strategic exit, and without the credibility of still being part of our established company, he was going to have a harder road than he likely expected. I did not sabotage him. I did not need to. The market has a way of correcting fantasies. As for Achterberg Fine Furniture, the company became mine. That should have felt like victory. Sometimes, if I am honest, it did. There was a clean satisfaction in knowing the business was no longer exposed to an internal threat. There was relief in not having to wonder what Bellamy might try next through a minority stake. There was pride in keeping the company whole, but there was also loneliness. When you spend half your life assuming you and your sibling are partners in the inheritance your parent left behind, it takes time to understand what it means to stand alone in the ownership column. I had always thought of the company as ours, even when we argued. Now it was mine in a way that felt both empowering and sad. I spent the next several months reviewing every part of the business with fresh eyes. I tightened some vendor relationships. I updated our internal governance language so nothing important was left to memory. I had Priscilla recheck the shareholder and succession documents, though shareholder now meant mostly me and eventually whoever inherited after me. I asked Cornelius to audit our records one more time just to make sure there were no other surprises hiding in old agreements or side arrangements. There were none. What there was, instead, was clarity. My father's caution, which Thaddeus had mocked as slow, had been wisdom. He had built the company to survive not just market changes but family weakness. He knew that if he left everything to trust, someone would eventually mistake trust for permission. He had been right. One afternoon, months after the lawsuit was resolved, I found myself alone in the original workshop, the one my father had refused to modernize completely because he believed some things should remain grounded in the hands that made them. A half-finished dining table stood on the center bench. The wood gleamed under the overhead lights. I ran my fingers along the edge and thought about all the times my father had stood in that same spot, checking a joint, correcting a cut, quietly making sure the work was honest. I thought about Thaddeus too. I did not miss him in the sentimental way people like to pretend all sibling estrangements are softened by time. What I missed was the version of him who had once been capable of telling the truth before damage became permanent. I missed the boy who used to sneak me scraps of walnut to carve tiny animals out of while our father worked. I missed the man who could have come to me and said, "I'm frustrated," or "I'm unhappy," or "I want out," and given us a chance to solve something instead of detonating everything. Instead, he had chosen secrecy. That, more than the money or the rival or the premium price, was the real wound. Not the sale itself, the decision to make me the last person who knew. Cornelius stopped by that afternoon to deliver a final report, and we ended up talking for nearly an hour. Families often assume their private understanding is stronger than their paperwork, he told me. But paperwork is what survives when feelings stop cooperating. I smiled a little at that, despite myself. That sounds like the kind of thing you say to people after disaster. It is, he said, also before disaster, if they listen. He looked around the workshop, then back at me. What you had here, he said, was a governance problem that looked like a trust problem until it became a litigation problem. That's a very cold way to describe my brother selling me out. Yes, he said, it is. I laughed for the first time in weeks, and it surprised me how good it felt. He was right, though. There was value in naming things correctly. What had happened was not some mysterious family curse. It was a breach. It was greed mixed with resentment, and enabled by the assumption that nobody would check the documents. It was exactly the kind of mess a good agreement is designed to prevent. That did not make it hurt less, but it made the hurt easier to carry. Thaddeus and I do not speak now. There are people who hear that and assume there must still be anger so intense it burns through every quiet moment. The truth is more complicated. The anger is there, yes, but it is joined by disappointment so deep it has become almost structural. I do not hate him. Hate would suggest a kind of ongoing connection I no longer want. I simply know what he chose, and I know what it cost. Achterberg Fine Furniture is still here. The people on the floor still know the difference between a rushed job and a well-made one. The clients who trust us still get what they were promised. I still review designs, still negotiate contracts, still sit at the desk my father used and sign my name where it matters. The company is mine now, but I run it the way it was meant to be run. Carefully, consistently, with a respect for the paper trail and the people behind it. Sometimes I think about that first phone call from Rhett Bellamy. If he had not been so polished, if he had not assumed I would take the news in stride, maybe I would have called Thaddeus first and given him a chance to lie. Maybe I would have shouted before I checked the agreement. Maybe Bellamy would still be sitting on 40% of a family business he had no right to touch. Instead, I kept my temper long enough to read the contract. That mattered. It mattered because our father had been smart enough to build protection into the foundation, and because I was stubborn enough not to let surprise become surrender. It mattered because Bellamy's legal team had been arrogant enough to think a good enough price could buy them past a restriction they had already seen. It mattered because Thaddeus believed resentment could excuse a secret deal with a rival. He was wrong. All of them were. What I learned, in the end, is that family businesses are not just about blood, and they are not just about affection. They are about structure, memory, and the discipline to honor the agreements that keep love from turning into chaos. My father understood that. Thaddeus forgot it. I was the one left to prove it. And if I ever needed proof that a quiet phone call can change a life, I got it that Tuesday morning when a stranger with a smooth voice called to schedule a shareholder meeting that should never have existed.